Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Religion. Religion in the form of art. Continued. The spiritual work of art. And there is nothing much more spiritual than Dali. The national spirits, which become conscious of their essence in the shape of a particular animal, coalesce into a single spirit. Thus it is that the separate beautiful national spirits unite into a single pantheon, the element and habitation of which is language. The pure intuition of itself as universal humanity has, in the actuality of the national spirit, this form. The national spirit combines with the others, with which it constitutes through nature a single nation, in a common undertaking, and for this task forms a collective nation and therewith a collective heaven. This universality to which spirit in its existence attains is, however, only this first universality which first issues from the individuality of the ethical sphere, which has not yet overcome its immediacy, has not yet formed a single state out of its peoples. The ethical life of the actual national spirit rests partly on the immediate trust of the individuals in their nation as a whole, partly on the direct share which all, regardless of differences of class, take in the decisions and actions of the government, in the union which to begin with is not a permanent arrangement but only for the purpose of a common action. That freedom of participation by each and all is, for the time being, put on one side. This first alliance is therefore more an assembly of individualities than their domination by an abstract thought which would rob the individuals of their self-conscious participation in the will and deed of the state. The assembly of national spirits constitutes a circle of shapes which now embraces the whole of nature, as well as the whole ethical world. They stand too under the supreme command of the one rather than under his sovereignty. By themselves they are the universal substances of what the self-conscious essence in itself is and does. This, however, constitutes the power and, in the first instance, the centre at least with which those universal beings are concerned, and which at first seems to merge their affairs only contingently. But it is the return of the divine being into self-consciousness that already contains the reason why self-consciousness forms the centre for those divine powers and conceals their unity to begin with, under the form of a friendly, eternal connection of the two worlds. The same universality which belongs to this content attaches necessarily also to the form of consciousness in which the content appears. It is no longer the actual practice of the cult, but a practice that is raised and yet indeed into the nation. Not yet indeed into the nation, but at first into picture thinking, into the synthetic linking together of self-conscious and external existence. The external existence of this picture thinking, language, is the earliest language, the epic as such, which contains the universal content of the world, universal at least in the sense of completeness, though not indeed as the universality of thought. The minstrel is the individual and actual spirit from whom, as a subject of this world, the world, is produced, and by whom it is born. His pathos is not the stupefying power of nature, but nemesthry. That's mother of the muses, by the way. Memory. Mnemosiny. Recollection and a gradually developed inwardness. The remembrance of essence that formerly was directly present. He is the organ that vanishes in its content. What counts is not his own self, but his muse, his universal song. What, however, is in fact present is the syllogism, in which the extreme of universality, the world of the gods, is linked with individuality with the minstrel. So the middle term of particularity, the middle term is the relation in its heroes, who are individual men like the minstrel, but presented only in idea and are thereby at the same time universal, like the free extreme of universality, the gods. In this epic, then, there is in general presented to consciousness what is implicitly accomplished in the cult, the relation of the divine to the human. The content is an action of the self-conscious essence. the acting disturbs the tranquillity of the substance and excites the essence so that its simple unitary nature is divided and opened up into the manifold world of natural and ethical powers. The action in the violation of the peaceful earth, the trench which, animated by blood, evokes the departed spirits, and these, thirsting for life, receive it in the action of self-consciousness. The business which is the object of these general exertions has two sides: the side of the self, by which the business is accomplished by the totality of actual nations, and the individuality standing at the head, and the side of the universal, by which it is accomplished by their substantial powers. Formerly, however, the relation of the two bore the character of a synthetic combination of the universal and the individual, that is, of picture thinking. On this specific character depends the appraisal of this world. The relation of the two is thus a mingling of them which inconsistently divides and apportions the unity of the action, and superfluously throws the action over from one side to the other. The universal powers have the form of individuality and hence the principle of action in them. What they effect appears therefore to proceed entirely from them and to be as free an action as that of men. Consequently, both gods and men have done one and the same thing. The earnestness of those divine powers is a ridiculous superfluity, since they are in fact the power or strength of the individuality performing the action, while the exertions and labour of the latter is an equally useless effort, since it is rather the gods who manage everything. Ephemeral mortals who are as nothing are at the same time the mighty self that brings into subjection the universal beings, offends the gods, and in general procures for them an actual existence and an interest in acting, just as conversely these impotent universal beings, who nourish themselves on the gifts of men and through them alone, get something to do, are the natural substance and the material of all events, and are equally the ethical matter and the pathos of action. If their elemental natures are first brought into actual existence and into an active relationship by the free self of individuality, they are no less universal that withdraws itself from this connection, that remains unrestricted in its own specific character, and through the invincible elasticity of its unity, effaces the atomistic singleness of the doer and his constructions. It preserves itself in its purity and dissolves everything individual in its fluid nature. Just as the gods fall into a contradictory relation with the self-like nature opposed to them, so too their universality comes into conflict with their own specific character and its relationship to others. They are the eternal, beautiful individuals who, serene in their own existence, are exempt from transitoriness and the influence of alien powers, but they are at the same time specific elements, particular gods, which therefore stand in relation to others, but that relation to others which, in virtue of the opposition involved in it, is a conflict with them, is a comical self-forgetfulness of their eternal nature. Determinateness is rooted in their divine existence and possesses in its limitation the independence of the whole individuality. Through this their characters at once lose the sharpness of their peculiar disposition and blend together in their ambiguity. One purpose of the activity, and their activity itself, since it is directed against another, and hence against an invincible divine power, is an arbitrary showing off, which at once melts away and transforms the apparent earnestness of the action into a harmless self-confident play without result or outcome. If, however, the nature of their divinity, the negative element, or the specific determinateness of that nature appears merely as the inconsistency of their activity, and as a contradiction between purpose and result, and if that independent assurance retains their preponderance over the element of determinateness, then by that very fact the pure power of the negative confronts it, and moreover as the ultimate power over it and against which it can do nothing. They are the universal and the positive over against the individual self of mortals, which cannot hold out against their might. But the universal self, for that reason, hovers over them and over this whole world of picture thinking, to which the entire content belongs as the irrational void of necessity, a mere happening which they must face as beings without a self, and sorrowfully, for these determinate natures cannot find themselves in this purity. Almighty Zeus, help me now. This necessity, however, is the unity of the notion, which brings under control the contradictory substantial being of the separate moments, a unity in which the inconsistency and arbitrariness of their action is orderly disposed, and the play of their actions receives its earnestness and worth in the actions themselves. The content of the world of pictorial thought freely unfolds itself in the middle term on its own account, gathering itself around the individuality of the hero, who, however, in his strength and beauty, feels his life is broken and sorrowfully awaits an early death. For the individuality that is in itself firmly established and actual is banished to its extreme and split into its moments, which have not yet found and united themselves. The one individual moment, the abstract non-actual one, is necessity, which shares in the life of the middle term just as little as does the other, the actual individual. The minstrel who keeps himself outside of it and is lost in his performance. Both extremes must draw nearer to the content. One of them, necessity, has to fill itself with the content, the other, the language of the minstrel, must participate in it, and the content formally, left to itself, must receive within it the certainty and the fixed character of the negative. This higher language, that of tragedy, gathers closer together the dispersed moments of the inner essential world and the world of action. The substance of the divine, in accordance with the nature of the notion, sunders itself into its shapes, and their movement is likewise in conformity with the notion. In regard to form, the language ceases to be a narrative because it enters into the content, just as the content ceases to be one that is imaginatively presented. The hero is himself the speaker, and the performance displays to the audience, who are also spectators, self-conscious human beings who know their rights and purposes, the power and the will of their specific nature and how to assert them. They are artists who do not express with unconscious unnaturalness and naivety the external aspect of their resolves and enterprises, as happens in the language accompanying ordinary actions in actual life. On the contrary, they give utterance to the inner essence. They prove the rightness of their action, and the pathos which moves them is soberly asserted and definitely expressed in its universal individuality, free from the accents of circumstance and personal idiosyncrasies. Lastly, these characters exist as actual human beings who impersonate the heroes and portray them not in the form of a narrative, but in the actual speech of the actors themselves. Just as it is essential for the statue to be the work of human hands, so is the actor essential to his mask, not as an external condition from which, artistically considered, we must abstract, or so far as we do have to make abstraction from it, we admit just this, that art does not yet contain in it the true and proper self. The general ground on which the movement of these shapes produced from the notion takes place is the consciousness expressed in the first imaginative language, that of the epic, where the content devoid of itself is left disunited. It is the commonality as such whose wisdom finds utterance in the chorus of the elders. In the powerlessness of this chorus, the commonalty has its representative, because the common people themselves constitute merely the positive and passive material of the individuality of their government confronting it. Lacking the power of the negative, it is unable to hold together and subdue the richness and varied abundance of the divine life, but lets it all go in its own separate ways. And in its reverential hymns, it extols each individual moment as an independent God, first one and then another. But where it does detect the earnestness of the notion, in its onward march, dashing these figures to pieces, and comes to see how ill it fares with its venerated gods who dare to trespass on ground where the notion holds sway. Then it is not itself the negative power which interferes. On the contrary, it clings to the selfless thought of such power, clings to the consciousness of an alien fate, and produces the empty desire for ease and comfort and feeble talk of appeasement. It is fear of the higher powers which are the immediate instruments of the substance, fearful of their struggles among themselves, and fearful of the simple self of necessity which crushes them as well as the living beings linked with them. In its compassion for these living beings, which it also knows to be the same as itself, it is conscious only of the paralyzing terror of this movement of equally helpless pity, and at the end of it all, the empty repose of submission to necessity, whose work is understood neither as a necessary deed of the character, nor as the action of the absolute being within itself. At the level of the spectator, consciousness, the chorus, the indifferent ground on which the performance takes place, spirit does not appear in its scattered multiplicity, but in the simple direction of the notion. Its substance therefore shows itself torn asunder merely into its two extreme powers. These elementary universal beings are at the same time self-conscious individualities, heroes, who place their consciousness in one of these powers. find in it determinateness of character and constitute the effective activity and actuality of these powers. This universal individuation descends again, as will be remembered, to the immediate reality of existence and presence itself to a crowd of spectators who have in the chorus their counterpart, or rather their own thought, expressing itself. At the same time, the ethical substance is divided with respect to its form or to knowing. Spirit, when acting, appears qua consciousness over against the object to which its activity is directed, and which consequently is determined as the negative of the knower. The doer finds himself thereby in the antithesis of knowing and not knowing. He takes his purpose from his character and knows it as an ethical essentiality. But on account of the determinants of his character, he knows only the one power of substance, the other remaining from him concealed. The present reality is therefore one thing in itself, and another thing for consciousness. The upper and the nether law come to signify in this connection the power that knows and reveals itself to consciousness, and the power that conceals itself and lies in ambush. The one in the aspect of light, the god of the oracle, who, in accordance with its natural moment, has sprung from the all-illuminating sun, knows all and reveals all. Phoebus and Zeus, who is his father, but the commands of all of this truth, speaking God and his announcements of what is, are really deceptive. For this knowing is in its principle immediately a not knowing, because consciousness, in its action, is in its own self this antithesis. He, Oedipus, who was able to unlock the riddle of the Sphinx, and he who trusted with childlike confidence, Orestes, are therefore both sent to destruction through what the god revealed to them. The priestess, through whom the beautiful god speaks, the Delphic oracle, is in no way different from the equivocating sisters of fate, the witches of Macbeth, who by their promises drive to crime those who listen to them, and who by the double-tongued character of what they announced as a certainty deceive him, Macbeth, who relied on the obvious meaning. The consciousness, Hamlet, therefore, that is purer than the latter, Macbeth, which believes witches and is more prudent, more solid, and thorough than the former, which trusts the priestess and the beautiful god, tarries with his revenge, even though the very spirit of his father reveals to him the crime by which he was murdered, and institutes still other proofs, for the reason that his revelatory spirit could also be the devil. Birth of a goddess. The grounds of this mistrust are that the knowing consciousness is caught up in the antithesis of the certainty of itself and objective essence. Ethical rightness, which holds that what actually is in itself nothing when opposed to absolute law, learns that its knowing is one-sided, its law only a law of its own character, and that it has seized on it only one of the powers of the substance. The action itself is this inversion of the known into its opposite, into being, is the changing round of the rightness based on character and knowing into the rightness of the very opposite with which the former is bound up in the essential nature of the substance, converted into the Furies, Erineus, if that's how it's pronounced, who embody the other power and character aroused into hostility. This netherite sits with Zeus on the throne and enjoys equal honour with the god who is revealed and known. To these three beings, the world of the gods of the chorus is restricted by the acting individuality. One of them is the substance, the power presiding over the hearth, and the spirit of family piety, as well as the universal power of state and government. Since this distinction belongs to the substance as such, when it is pictorially represented, it is not individualized in two distinct figures, but has in actuality the two persons of its characters. On the other hand, the distinction between knowing and not knowing falls within each of the self-consciousness, and only in abstraction in the element of universality is it divided into two individual shapes, for the self of the hero has an existence only as a whole consciousness, and is therefore essentially the whole of the distinction belonging to the form, but its substance is determinate and only one side of the distinguished content belongs to him. Therefore, the two sides of consciousness, which have in actuality no separate individuality peculiar to each, receive, when pictorially represented, each its own particular shape. The one that of the revelatory God, the other that of the Furies, who keep themselves concealed. In part, both enjoy equal honour, but again the shape assumed by the substance, Zeus, is the necessity of the relation of the two to each other. The substance is the relation, first, that of knowing is for itself, but has its truth in what is simple, and second, B, that the distinction through and in which actual consciousness exists has its basis in that inner being which destroys it. And thirdly, C, that the clear conscious assurance of certainty has its confirmation in forgetfulness. Consciousness disclosed this antithesis through action. Acting in accordance with the knowledge revealed, it finds out that that knowledge is deceptive, and in being committed as regards the content of that knowledge to one of the attributes of substance, it violated the other, and so gave it the right as against itself. In following the God that knows, it really got hold of what was not revealed, and pays the penalty of trusting a knowledge whose ambiguity, for such is its nature, and also becomes explicit for consciousness, and a warning to it. The ravings of the priestess, the inhuman shape of the witches, the voices of trees and birds, and that should say, the voices of trees and birds, dreams and so forth, are not the ways in which truth manifests itself. They are warning signs of deception, of an absence of self-possession, of the singularity and contingency of the knowing, or, in other words, the opposite power which is violated by consciousness is present as expressed law and valid right, whether law of the family or of the state. Consciousness, on the other hand, followed its own way of knowing and concealed from itself what was openly revealed. The truth, however, of the opposing powers of the content or the knowledge and of consciousness is the result that both are equally right, and therefore in their antithesis, which is brought about by action, are equally wrong. The action in being carried out demonstrates their unity in the natural downfall of both powers and both self-conscious characters. The reconciliation of the opposition with itself is the lether of the underworld. The lether, that's the river of forgetfulness, in case you've forgotten. The lether of the underworld in death, or the lether of the upper world as absolution, not from guilt, for consciousness cannot deny its guilt, because it committed the act, but from the crime and also the peace of mind following atonement for the crime. Both are oblivion, the vanishedness of the reality and the action of the powers of substance, of their individualities and of the powers of the abstract thought of good and evil. For none of them by itself is the essence, which rather is the repose of the whole within itself, the unmoved unity of fate, the peaceful existence and consequent inactivity and lack of vitality of family and government, and the equal honour and consequent indifferent unreality of Apollo and the Furies, and the return of the spiritual life and activity into the unity being of Zeus. This fate completes the depopulation of heaven, of that unthinking mingling of individuality and essence, a mingling whereby the action of essence appears as inconsequent, arbitrary, unworthy of itself, for individuality that is only superficially attached to essence is unessential. The expulsion of such shadowy, insubstantial picture thoughts, which was demanded by the philosophers of antiquity, thus already begins in Greek tragedy. In general, through the fact that the division of the substance is controlled by the notion, and consequently individuality is essential individuality, and the determinations of our absolute characters. The self-consciousness that is represented in tragedy knows and acknowledges therefore only one supreme power, and this use only as the power of the state or of the hearth, and in the antithesis belonging to knowing or of knower and known only as the father of the particular that is taken shape in the knowing, and also as the Zeus of the oath and of the Furies, the zero of the universal, the Zeus of the universal, of the inner being dwelling in concealment, the further moments issuing from the notion and dispersed throughout the pictorial representation, moments which the chorus allows to hold sway one after the other, are, on the other hand, not the pathos of the hero. They sink to the level of passions in the hero, to the level of contingent insubstantial moments which, though praised by the impersonal chorus, are not capable of constituting the character of the heroes, nor of being expressed and honoured as their essential nature. But also the persons of the divine being itself, as well as the character of its substance, coalesce into the simplicity of what is without consciousness. This necessity has, in contrast to self-consciousness, the characteristic of being the negative power of all the shapes that appear, a power in which they do not recognize themselves, but on the contrary perish. The self appears merely as assigned to the character, not as the mediating factor of the movement, but self-consciousness, the simple certainty of self, is in fact the negative power, the unity of Zeus, of substantial being, and of abstract necessity. It is the spiritual unity into which everything returns, because actual self-consciousness is still distinguished from the substance and fate. It is partly the chorus, or rather the crowd of spectators, whom this movement of the divine life fills with fear as being something alien, or in whom this movement, as something close to them, produces merely the emotion of passive sympathy, partly so far as consciousness is involved and belongs to the characters. This union is an external one, is a hypocrisy, because the true union, that of the self, fate and substance, is not yet present. The hero who appears before the onlooker splits up into his mask, and the actor into the person, into the play, and the actual self. The self-consciousness of the hero must step forth from his mask and present itself as knowing itself to be the fate both of the gods of the chorus and of the absolute powers themselves, and as being no longer separated from the chorus, from the universal consciousness. Ah, lovely Venus. Comedy has therefore, above all, the aspect that actual self-consciousness exhibits itself as the fate of the gods. These elementary beings are as universal moments, not as self, and are not equal. They are, it is true, endowed with a form of individuality, but this is only in imagination and does not really and truly belong to them. The actual self does not have such an abstract moment for its substance and content. If the subject is raised above such a moment, such a single property, and clothed in the mask it proclaims it, the irony of such a property, wanting to be something on its own account. The pretensions of universal essentiality are uncovered in the self. It shows itself to be entangled in an actual existence and drops the mask just because it wants to be something genuine. The self, appearing here in its significance as something actual, plays with the mask which it once put on in order to act its part, but it as quickly breaks out again from this illusory character and stands forth in its own nakedness and ordinariness, which it shows to be not distinct from the genuine self, the actor, or from the spectator. This general dissolution of the shapes of the essentiality as a whole in their individuality becomes in its content more petulant and bitter, insofar as the content has its more serious and necessary meaning. The divine substance unites within itself the meaning of natural and ethical essentiality as regards the natural element, actual self-consciousness, those in the very fact of employing things of nature for its adornment, for its dwelling, and also in feasting on its sacrificial offering. That is itself the fate to which the secret is revealed, namely the truth about the essential independence of nature. In the mystery of bread and wine, it appropriates this independence along with the meaning of the inner essence, and in comedy, it is conscious of the irony of this meaning generally. Now, insofar as this meaning contains ethical essentiality, it is partly the nation in its two aspects of the state, or demos proper, and the individuality of the family. Partly, however, it is the self-conscious, pure knowing, or the rational thinking of the universal. This demos, the general mass, which knows itself as lord and ruler, and is also aware of being the intelligence and insight which demand respect, is constrained and befooled through the particularity of its actual existence, and exhibits a ludicrous contrast between its own opinion of itself and its immediate existence, between its necessity and contingency, its universality and its commonness. If the principle of its individuality separated from the universal makes itself conspicuous in the proper shape of an actual existence, and openly usurps and administers the commonwealth to which it is a secret detriment, then there is exposed more immediately the contrast between the universal as theory and that with which the practice is concerned. There is exposed the complete emancipation of the purposes of the immediate individuality from the universal order, and the contempt of such an individuality for that order. Rational thinking frees the divine being from the contingent shape, and in antithesis to the unthinking wisdom of the corpus, which produces all sorts of ethical maxims and gives currency to a host of laws and specific concepts of duty and of right. Lifts these into the simple ideas of the beautiful and the good. The movement of this abstraction is the consciousness of the dialectic contained in these maxims and laws themselves, and consequently the consciousness of the vanishing of the absolute validity previously attaching to them. With the vanishing of the contingent character and superficial individuality which imagination lent to the divine beings, all that is left to them as regards their natural aspect is the bareness of their immediate existence. They are clouds, an evanescent mist, like those imaginative representations. The essence of these having been given the form of thought, they have become the simple thoughts of the beautiful and the good, which tolerate being filled with any kind of content. The power of dialectic knowledge puts specific laws and maxims of conduct at the mercy of the pleasure and frivolity of youth, which is led astray by it, and provides weapons for deceiving old age with its fears and apprehensions, and which is restricted to life in its individual aspect. The pure thoughts of the beautiful and the good thus display a comic spectacle through their liberation from the opinion which contains both their specific determinateness as content and also their absolute determinateness. Liberation, that is, from the firm hold of consciousness on these determinatenesses. They become empty. And just for that reason, the sport of mere opinion and of caprice, and the caprice of any chance individuality. Therefore, the fate which up to this part has lacked consciousness, and consists in an empty repose and oblivion, and is separated from self-consciousness, this fate is now united with self-consciousness. The individual self is the negative power through which and in which the gods and also their moments, namely exist in nature, and the thoughts of their specific characters vanish. At the same time, the individual self is not the emptiness of this disappearance, but on the contrary preserves itself in this very nothingness, abides with itself, and is the sole actuality. In it, the religion of art is consummated and has completely returned into itself through the fact that it is the individual consciousness in the certainty of itself that exhibits itself as the absolute power. This latter has lost the form of something presented to consciousness, something altogether separate from consciousness and alien to it, as were the statue and also the living, beautiful corporeality of the content of the epic and the powers and persons of tragedy. This unity, too, is not the unconscious unity of the cult and the mysteries. On the contrary, the actual self of the actor coincides with what he impersonates, just as the spectator is completely at home in the drama performed before him and sees himself playing in it. What this self-consciousness beholds is that whatever assumes the form of essentiality over against it is instead dissolved in it, in its thinking, its existence, and its action, and is at its mercy. It is the return of everything universal into the certainty of itself, which in sequence is this complete loss of fear and of essential being on the part of all that is alien. The self-certainty is a state of spiritual well-being and of repose therein, such as is not to be found anywhere outside of this comedy. The Temple of Diana. I knew a Diana once. Lovely woman. She told me that her mother was a fan of the 1960s British TV series The Avengers, which featured Emma Peel, played by Diana Rigg. So My Lovely Lady was named after Diana Rigg. But it would have been more appropriate had she been named after Diana, the goddess. I wonder where she is now.